Hi there, my name's Lockie. I'm a Microsoft technical trainer and it's great to have you with us today. In this video, we're going to be looking at insider risk management as part of Microsoft Purview. Now, insider risk management can be quite a sensitive topic, so I want to make sure you understand how it should be utilized, what are some of the steps that you need to take to plan and prepare to use it properly, and what it actually takes to create and then ongoing manage an insider risk policy once created. As part of the Information Protection Framework, this comes under the Manage Internal Risk capacity. For more information on the Information Protection Framework, head on over to Microsoft Learn. Now, when you look to roll out insider risk management in your organization, there are some really critical things you need to think about in the planning stage. Much of the planning phase of insider risk management rollout actually is about understanding what it is we are looking to actually identify and respond to. The internal risks we're looking to work with here are varied, but they are scoped. This is not going to be used for every type of internal investigation, but there are some clear things that we need to follow. Planning requirements and stakeholder engagement, as well as getting the right prerequisites in place, are going to be critical to your success in the rollout. Let's begin with a little bit of the understanding of potential insider risks that we may face. Now, there's two broad categories that we're going to be working with: malicious threats and accidental threats. These represent two different potential avenues where a user may go through and commit something that raises the risk level as an internal actor. Now, malicious focuses on things like the misusing of data, misusing of systems, the abuse of systems. But this does also contain some other things that aren't normally thought about. Sabotage, of course, but also fraud. Misuse of systems, yes, but also misappropriation of tooling to abuse others. These come within the malicious insider component. Accidental technically comes under the same insider risk management category. This is where user error, misconfiguration, the emailing of sensitive files to wrong recipients, falling for phishing attacks. These sorts of things come under the accidental category and yet are still under this same insider risk framework. Because of this, we end up in a very strange spot. Some risky behavior looks like normal behavior. Normal activity like downloading files, accessing SharePoint can be a risky activity. Using a traditional tool like a firewall is not going to patch or catch something that is effectively normal most of the time. What we focus on in insider risk management is looking at behavioral intent. So, over time, how do we actually track what a user normally does so we can detect when someone goes off the beaten path? Now, within the insider risk management component of Purview, there is a few critical areas that it is able to help you with. Detecting potential data leaks. Note the word potential there. This is about giving you ability to identify risks early or potential risks in a more categorized format. To be able to surface unusual activity, risky behavior comes in many different forms, and it's about finding it through different categorization strategies to be able to say, hey, this may represent an elevated risk, so you may need to action this in some additional way. We need to be able to generate alerts. These are done via policies such as data leak policies or security violation policies, so we can go through and surface these to the security team so they are able to take their additional actions. It also has a notification process within it. We should be letting users know that they have undertaken a potentially risky behavior. There's no point keeping them in the dark, or else the behavior is never going to change. And of course, it also gives us a privacy-focused approach to this. Now, that last one can feel unusual, but this is because there is an investigative component of insider risk management as well. The incorporation of other teams that need to be involved, such as HR and legal, when you're working through an insider risk threat, we need to make sure that there's a secure workspace where everyone can run their investigation. IRM provides that location that is privacy-focused to be able to work through and essentially provide that level of privacy. So in the event that someone is actually found to be a threat, we still do the things that we need to detect and act on behavior, but not focus on identities. We can keep ourselves at the right distance here. Throughout the focus of IRM, we pseudonymize most default usernames, so we can ensure that when a username pops up, there's not going to be a bias around the action. We are focused purely on the behavioral characteristics of a user. So with this in mind, that we have essentially a cross-functional toolset to use, planning is going to be cross-functional. You immediately need to identify what stakeholders must be involved in any sort of privacy or compliance-based investigation. You may have dedicated teams for this or teams wearing multiple hats, but you need to ensure that these stakeholders are ID'd early. HR is going to be important because what if you represent, say, an employee that's potentially leaking data in a departing employee scenario, someone who's about to leave and they're going through and printing lots of documents? We will require HR to potentially take action there or be advised about when they are leaving. So we need to involve them as part of the investigation. Same goes for legal, compliance, security. Involve the people that are required for your environment there. Now, from a prerequisite perspective, IRM functions entirely on signals. You need to ensure that signals are being fed in, or else we can't actually action these policies. The more data we can provide to insider risk management, the more accurate it will be in determining that a threat has potentially arrived. Make sure you've got the licensing confirmed. E5 is generally required for IRM capabilities, and you've got the integration set up. This goes beyond what we can do in terms of Defender for Endpoint or DLP policies within Purview. This also goes into Purview Audit, enabling HR connectors into other systems, connectors into your ITSM workflows. There is going to be a lot of potential enablement we need to work through here, and it may not be a one and done. Your prerequisites are going to have a set key piece of requirements depending on the policies you wish to put in place, but you're likely going to want to roll out further indicators over time. Speaking of which, indicators over time, you'll need to adjust thresholds based on feedback. So there are going to be certain times where a mistrigger may occur. What do you do in that scenario, and how do you handle it in order for users to provide the feedback that something may have gone wrong? You also may need to increase certain thresholds or make them more sensitive because it didn't detect certain behavior. There has to be some sort of adjustment period where you are working on this and ensuring that things do get adjusted and piloted over time. And of course, as we say with all things in Purview, run in the equivalent of a simulation mode here, run a pilot. Make sure you work with users that understand the system, know what is entailed, and are working with sensitive information. Target your most sensitive information first and your most at-risk users, and then roll it out from there as you become used to the tooling and as we're confident that it is capturing the things that it needs to. Ironically though, as much as we work with our sensitive users, it's actually better to start with benign activities. Things like logging of activity and notifications are the better place to begin as opposed to kicking off investigations and incidents outright. So start with educated users, low-risk activities that work in a high compliance scenario. That would be the trifecta to look for. Once you've got all of these pieces in place, your licensing, your logging, your sources connected, and of course, the right roles assigned to the administrator, we now need to make sure that we've got all of the things set up within IRM itself. Essentially, if we don't have all of this in place, we can't even get into the point where we can start actually working with our other settings within the environment. So, what do we need as a starting point? Indicators. Now, I'll show you in a demonstration on how to actually connect indicators up and make sure that they're put in place. But essentially, insider risk management will not detect anything unless you turn an indicator explicitly on. This goes for downloading files, risky browser behavior, actions on a device, SharePoint, OneDrive, etc. These all come in as part of a policy indicator framework. Next, there are privacy controls, and by default, we do put pseudonymization on usernames. You can choose to disable that if you need to, but you need to consider the privacy implications of what that could mean. We have the ability to set up detection groups. These are extremely useful because you can target high-priority users by saying, these are our high-priority users. For example, we could target leadership in a single group or our ops team or our security team to ensure that we're looking at those with more scrutiny or with a different level of scrutiny compared to the general user environment. And Also, who needs this data? I'm sure immediately, even without thinking about it too hard, you can think of about 5 other groups in your organization that would be very, very interested in potential insider risk threats. So, who else needs to see this information? When an alert gets raised, it's not just about starting an investigation with yourself. Is that a signal that someone in the security team might need for orchestration purposes, or someone within the security operations center might need for their investigative purposes? Make sure you are considering who needs to be interlinked into your system and seeing the same things that you're seeing. Now, with all of this put together, as long as we can align all of this with your internal frameworks about compliance and making sure that we work with employee trust, not against it, we can have a strong environment to protect our employees. Ultimately, that is what this is for. As much as it is protecting the organization, strong insider risk management means strong protected environments for employees to work safely in their work. So, we need to start getting ourselves hooked up. Now, connectors are going to be one of the critical ways for us to be able to feed in extra information, to start enabling all of the signals that mean that we can actually get this stuff done. So I'll talk about how the different tools that we can hook in, and there is a multitude of different tools available, can actually basically bolster your risk signals. The more risk signals we can ingest, the better the potential outcome. The better the outputs, the more fidelity we have, and the more risk signals we can work with to get a full picture of how our employees are behaving and where a risk may be surfacing. I'll talk through a couple of the individual connectors within the HR, etc., but I am also going to focus on Defender for Endpoint. It's got a pretty unique role in insider risk management and the correlation engine within it. So we'll talk a little bit about how it affects the heuristics specifically. Let's get started. Now, when we do start connecting other data sources to IRM, ultimately, we're going to either be connecting a connector, think external tools, HR systems, healthcare logs, physical access data, these sorts of tools that allow Microsoft 365 to ingest, or we are going to be ingesting from security solutions. Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Cloud Apps, Purview within the browser space. We're going to be utilizing these in combination. Now, the intent and use of these is slightly different. A connector is more focused on adding different types of risk assessment values. So, the more information we can get from, say, a HR system around when someone has resigned from a job, or when someone has moved positions, or when someone has been let go from the company and we enact a departing user policy, we can feed that in as a mechanism to assess the risk of the user. But when we're hooking into, say, a Defender system, that is where we can start to look at discrepancies. If we've got access to physical data, Defender for Endpoint can tell us if someone has accessed an environment and then accessed a privileged workspace. We can use this to look at device activity and then give policy violation alerts in real time, directly based on usage of applications and devices. These connectors are really the key to being able to populate the various indicators that are used in some of the pre-configured policies within Purview as well. So make sure whenever you look at the templates that you check, what connectors is it suggesting? There's likely a reason that it's looking for that information, and it's only going to lead to better results. Now, we'll start with the HR connector because this is certainly one of the strongest connectors we have. Because it has the ability to look at a range of different employment status verifications, termination, resignation, managed changing, these sorts of things, we can use it to drive policy decisions in insider risk in a really strong way. HR data does need to be exported in CSV, JSON, or TSV, and the connector itself does has a few prerequisites in terms of the permissions you'll need to get it set up. But effectively, once you go through the initial linking process, we'll be able to use this across a range of different policy templates for data theft by a departing user or risky AI usage. There are a couple of things that we do need to remember within the compliance space, though. HR data handling, especially within the EU and other regions that are starting to implement more and more privacy requirements, a la GDPR, there will be data minimization standards you may need to follow. So please make sure that you investigate based on your local requirements if this is going to be a suitable solution for you to put in place. When you are going through and setting this up, make sure you are considering how often the data is updating as well. One of the worst things that we could do would be kick off an investigation because the data that we are using is stale. We want to make sure that things are fresh, live, and relevant. So make sure you are working through following the privacy requirements that you need to and ingesting data from as many sources as possible. Aggregation across multiple HR systems is a valid and very good approach because it gives a potentially better heuristic view, being able to see how things change from system to system over time as the different systems interlink. Now, separate to HR, I also want to look at the healthcare connector. For customers that are working within the healthcare sector, this is specifically for you to meet your regulatory requirements around the use of patient records and unauthorized access to healthcare systems. Many of the baseline components remain the same, but they do need to conform to the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources Standard, the FHIR standard. So make sure that your system does support that before you go down the path of the data connector here. Most major systems do. However, if you can enable this, a special policy is available focused just on healthcare record misuse. We are looking at how people are utilizing and accessing patient data to be able to understand where there is potentially a violation in, say, HIPAA or GDPR. The indicators that are coming through here are focused on different job roles and can be mapped to things like patient care activity. So if an administrator is accessing records when not treating a patient, that represents risky behavior, but a nurse in field duty would not. So we can use this to be able to correlate user activities with the role they're actually taking. Because of the mechanisms that it has for being able to go through and assess in the dynamic ways as well, there's also quite a lot of interesting things that we can assess. Think coworker snooping. There's some very interesting indicators you can leverage within this to start looking at how this is working through. Since this is very much related to the healthcare sector, you will want to make sure that you verify not only regional availability as it's currently in preview, but also any potential risks around how you implement this and what specific controls you'll need to put in place to make sure you meet your local legislation and regulatory requirements. The last of the major connectors I want to look at is the physical badging connector. This is connecting PhysSec into our work within the insider risk space. We want to ensure that when a physical resource is accessed, we can essentially go through and map that across to a digital resource. It's very easy to work out that if a privileged access workstation has been accessed by a user and it's only available in a specific room and the user hasn't badged into that room, the physical access pattern looks suspicious. But we only know that through the correlation. Being able to look at how users with suspicious physical activities are behaving potentially when a data leak has occurred or when they are undertaking other risk activities gives us a proper full picture of not only insider behavior in a digital sense, but also how they have moved physically through your organization. Since we support multiple different badge sources, we support this policy across a wide range of templates. Note as well that some of these templates, data leaks by risky users, etc., these are actually ones that support not only the connectors we've looked at already, as well as physical badging. These are essentially optional enrichments. But if you can go through and put these in place, you can have an extremely strong aggregated system to be able to track these different indicators across the environment. Think about how you can build these things together and build out a way of matching your internal digital risk events with those physical risk events. All right, we've talked about the main types of connectors that we hook up, but now I want to look at some of the Microsoft-based connectors. Because Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps enables visibility into user activity when we aren't necessarily in a Microsoft environment, we can look at third-party applications in the cloud as an example. We can actually use its connectors to be able to analyze risk signals for other locations. Think a user that is doing a mass upload of data to an external service like Google Drive, or maybe is doing a mass download from a sanctioned service into an unsanctioned service. We can use these as examples to think about the ways in which we can use the data that comes from Defender for Cloud Apps to actually influence some of our different escalation privileges here. Think about the sorts of policy indicators you could use in, say, a data leak by priority user by checking to see if a user with a high risk level inherent to their role suddenly starts going through and working with risk indicators and elevating risk indicators for third-party services they don't typically access. These are the sorts of things that are really important to note, and we do highlight pretty strongly in the portal that the cloud app risk indicators are treated with the same equal weight in policy templates. Make sure that you're thinking about what you connect and what you want to examine here. But if you're looking to look for unsanctioned uploads to third-party solutions, this is a great way to track exactly that. Simply hook up Defender for Cloud Apps and utilize the protection there. We get the same deal if we go across to something like Defender for Endpoint. Because the risk detection there is focused on the physical device, think a Windows laptop in front of you or a Macintosh laptop, we can use this as a way to look for different types of unauthorized access related to the device itself. So, some things we can do that are important here. We can track and make sure that when a USB drive is utilized, users do not upload certain types of sensitive files to that drive. If someone tries to mass print a large amount of information, we can actually use that as a signal to identify that someone is potentially doing something untoward. To enable this, really the only thing you need to do is enable Defender for Endpoint and turn the signals on. There are indicators available in IRM natively for use with Defender for Endpoint, and the integrations allow us to get essentially visibility directly into security device events. One of the really critical things that Defender for Endpoint really does give us, though, is the ability to have live signals. We don't have to wait for the data to be processed in the cloud. This is based on the actions that are happening on the device in the moment. It's about as close as we can get to what we have with the physical badging connector, where we have that quick scan. But now it is as it happens on the device. And with the combination of something like DLP, we can add controls to not only alert, but then prevent the action from actually completing. Great double whammy to be able to combine those together. All right, we've got an idea of the connectors, the things we can hook up. I think now we should probably talk about the policies you can actually create. Inside of risk management policies, it's a process. It's something you need to think about and plan early. We already talked about the broad planning phase, but now I want to talk about the practical. When you actually go through to implement it, what are some of the things that you have available out of the box versus what do you have to configure yourself? Let's get ourselves started with a little bit of some of the policy templates. Now, templates are actually not the only way to create things within your insider risk management space. And I mean that not just that there's also custom, of course. We actually support something called a quick policy as well. Take a look at some of the templates we see here. Data theft by departing users, risky AI usage, someone uploading sensitive data into an AI tool, healthcare record misuse, risky browser usage. These are all templates that you are likely going to want to apply some sort of customization to, maybe changing risk levels or maybe altering what signals you pull in, those sorts of things. But for many scenarios, organizations were looking for something that's even faster. Essentially a set of quick wins that we could focus on where we need to be able to just get something that gets us into the space fast. For that, we look to quick policies. Quick policies give us a mechanism to essentially, in about 2 minutes, that's the usual time frame to implement here, go through and complete a pre-configured insider risk management policy. It is aligned with common risk scenarios and it gives us a fast setup with very little customization required to actually get yourself going. The quick policies are a great approach if what you are looking to do is just start. Think common scenarios around data leaks or unusual file activity. Think small organizations needing to roll out or a pilot phase where we're testing things. Now, you can't configure the full scope or detection indicators in a quick policy, but as a beginning point, this is where I always recommend you start. Mostly because if you identify a gap with a quick policy, you now know exactly what you need to do in the custom space. Custom policies can either be built entirely from scratch with complex triggers around role-based detection, data from HR, all of these different sources, or you can choose to start with the template and then customize from there. Either way, you can have significantly closer alignment with different compliance procedures within your organization. Compliance policies are definitely not the first place that we typically go to. Quick policies, because of their limited scope, are a great place to begin. But most organizations over time trend towards those custom integrations. Now that we've talked about all of the different signals we can feed in, I'm going to start talking about how we actually design policies. As much as we've looked at what could actually alert us, now we need to talk about how we're going to get alerted. When we create our insider risk management policies, there's a few approaches we can take, ranging from a fully customized solution all the way through to an extremely fast templated option. So I'll run you through with some of the different options that are there. Where you want to use something that focuses on common risk scenarios, we can look at that. But otherwise, we do have that ability to customize and then over time manage as required. Now, templates include a number of different goals, and think of these as the starting point. Common templates include things for data theft by departing users, data leaks, risky AI usage, great if you're looking at unsanctioned AI applications, as well as risky browser usage, perfect to capture everything else that someone might copy some sensitive data into. But these sorts of templates typically require some customization. There's a little bit extra that you'll want to put into it, some additional signal you might want to feed in. Because of that, we've also included a secondary category of specialized templates. Outside of things like device and network-related security issues within our security policy violations, we could also instead look at a simpler, faster template in the form of the quick policy. Now, quick policies are super interesting to me because they represent about a 2-minute lead time to get a policy implemented. That's unusual. These policies usually take quite a bit of time to tune and tweak. But the idea of a quick policy is for organizations that are maybe just starting in a proof of concept stage, a pilot, or they're looking to tackle some small problems fast. They give you common avenues to be able to work within a series of common needs. Think things like common data leaks, unusual file activity, minimal configuration, preset signals ready to go. All you need to do is enable the connectors, and we can't even do a lot of scope configuration. The goal here is not to do a big custom deployment. It's to get you something that works quickly. With that said, most organizations over time trend away from quick policies and into the custom space. Because custom policies allow us to either start with a template or start completely from scratch, we essentially end up with much more complex scenarios available. We can trigger based on roles, we can trigger based on data from different endpoint sources, we can look at different internal alignments based on different procedure requirements. Even the ability to go through and use certain integrations is tied into this ability to customize a template. Think about quick policies as that limited in scope but limited in intent space. You can get them done fast, but if you need something that's more advanced or you're finding that you're limited by what they can achieve, that's by design. Move across to the custom templates once you need that next level of integration. Now, custom policies require additional thought. As I said, you can definitely start with a policy template, but there's a lot of conditions you now need to start thinking about. What are the sources you're going to look at? Ultimately, where are you going to actually affect this policy? Is it only certain mailboxes or users, or is it across the organization as a whole? How are we prioritizing the different risk signals that are available to us? Even down to what events are actually going to trigger the policy itself. All of this has to come into the mix, and you do have the ability to add additional privacy controls at this level around pseudonymization to ensure that user data is not shown directly. With the policy set up in place, we now have that ability to now think about detections, and the same level of customization applies. What indicators are going to be important to you? Is it that someone has opened a SharePoint file, or is it they've uploaded one, or is it they've moved it, or is it they renamed it? These are all different indicators we can leverage in different forms. So thinking about which individual indicators actually match the scenario you're working with, or more likely, group of indicators, we can adjust scopes and things dynamically, we can adjust different prioritizations, and we can re-weight all of these different components to ensure that we're targeting the right stuff. There is a potential when we work with insider risk management to not tune to the point where we understand and we can show enough information, essentially too much noise. So we need to be careful about where we're rolling this out. You should be able to go through and find the different triggers and indicators that work for your organization and be able to prioritize them to create thresholds that make sense for your org. So feel free to know that this is definitely not a one and done. You will tune these over time and you will build out a roster of different indicator patterns and policies that match different frameworks you need. Critical to that point is the ability to actually look at policies over time. So we provide you a number of different tools and portal points to be able to understand how a policy is actually working. Because it's not set and forget, it's going to require ongoing tuning to remain not only effective, but to reduce false positives and adapt when your organization changes. We need to be able to look at things like health. So how effective is it? Is it actually catching the needs that it requires? Is it a warning-based thing? Is there something wrong with the data that's coming in? Are we seeing outdated or unused configuration that's not coming through? We should be looking at this to understand the trends of when things are being activated and under what conditions. We can also look at the scope as part of this. As part of the reporting, you'll be able to see if thresholds are too low because we're seeing too many alerts that are low value. Work with teams to understand where there is irrelevant data being fed through and how you could potentially reduce the scope or adjust policies to ensure that insider risk management policies are not triggering too often. There's actually a kind of a fun thing we can do as an additional point as well. Sometimes it's easier to just duplicate a policy instead of going through and making changes directly. If you wish to have a subset test group of users, maybe a ring zero that we test policies out on first, you can duplicate policies and make changes, effectively have an A/B where we can compare and contrast the two different offerings to see what the signal levels look like. You can use this to modify scope and settings separately and even break a policy into multiple intents if we need to. And of course, at some point, you're going to need to remove a policy. When you need to delete a policy, remember, you can choose to delete only the policy or the policy and the related data that it has gathered. Just make sure that you're picking the right choice for what you need to do. And note that when you go through and delete it, this also deletes any related alerts. It can take up to 72 hours to clean these policies out of your system because of that mechanism. So just remember this as part of the structure. You need to be conducting, if not ongoing review, at least a fairly frequent review cycle of your different policies. Work with your teams to understand, especially after major organization changes such as layoffs or security incidents, that a review will be required to understand the new posture of the insider risk management and to look for the gaps where policies may no longer fit. All right. Now, last point I want to touch on is a little bit of the forensic evidence. Forensic evidence is some of the most sensitive information that we can gather when it comes to end user components. So by default, forensic evidence is not turned on. I've enabled it here in this screenshot so we can see some of the settings, but note that in regulated industries, this may be appropriate, but for other organizations, this may be a step too far. Forensic evidence requires the installation of the Purview client agent on an endpoint, and what it will do is capture data directly. This includes screenshots of the screen at the time that a risky action is taken. If text input is put into a browser field, it will capture that text directly. This is essentially a direct capture and recording of the screen and the content that a user is accessing. Because of the nature of this sort of data, there is usually a dual authorization required in order to be able to view any of this information. If you are looking to go down the path of capturing additional forensic evidence, note that this is something you will need to notify your users about, and they will need to have a clear setup around how this is going to be accessed, a clear set of controls about when it is accessed. You'll need to work with compliance team, legal team, HR team to understand the scenarios under which it's appropriate to access this forensic evidence. But if it is something that is required for your particular scenario, say a remote job post for a sensitive administrative action, this is what this is designed for. Forensic evidence can be enabled. You can choose how the capturing actually works, whether it is on action or a certain number of times per day, and choose things like bandwidth update as well to make sure that it's not going to overburden your network connections. All right. Now, I'm going to go through and set up some insider risk managed policies in the portal. There's a number of different approaches we can take, and I've shown you some of them, so I'm going to take you through at least some of the common ones. Some quick access policies, a few things around templates, and a little bit about how some of the different indicators actually get through and get enabled. Let's jump in. Okay, now, we are currently over in the Microsoft Purview portal. We're going to be going through and looking at insider risk management broadly, but there's a couple of prerequisites that do actually need to be set up for everything that I'm about to show you to work. You need to make sure that the user you're using to do this work has the insider risk management role group assigned to them, and that any integration prerequisites you need are already set up. Now, to set all of the integration points, you head across into the Settings tab of Purview and into Information Protection to be able to view those details. To get ourselves started, we're going to go across and configure just a couple of our policy indicators to make sure that they are set up. With the connectors in place, the indicators allow us to, well, indicate what needs to be pulled in to be able to enact various policies down the line. In our insider risk management space, we'll open up the policy indicators, and I'm going to enable just a couple of different signals in this space. The first will be the Office indicators. This allows us to use things like SharePoint, OneDrive, Exchange, Teams, and essentially pull in signals that come from there and use them as reactive components down the line for other policies and different spaces in that spot. There are plenty of other indicators focused on things like Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Cloud Apps, Physical App Security, based on what you can integrate. But the other one that's going to be important is the cumulative exfiltration detection. This is a special one that is based on the heuristics of a user. So we look at them in the comparison of their cohort, and then over time, we are able to essentially detect a logic of exfiltration patterns. So a download plus an upload together would be an exfiltration sequence of events that would trigger. This allows us to compare whether things within are working against organizational norms or against peer group norms. Both are options and both are good signals to use depending on your scenario. Now, in order to get ourselves really going, we're going to go through and start creating our policies. And we're going to start with the simplest option, which is the quick policy. Heading on over to Insider Risk Management, we'll open up our quick policy view. These are the quick deployments, limited customization options that are available. We'll open them up here, and we're just going to quickly jump into that policy view. And when we do hit that Create Policy button, we'll be presented with either a custom policy that could use a template starting point or the quick policy. Of the quick policies that are there are currently a few that are available to you out of the box. The first is data leaks, pretty common as something we want to protect. The second is data theft by users leaving the org. Third is critical asset protection. You'll need to determine what a critical asset is to make this work, so consider there's going to be additional setup with these ones. Email exfiltration and risky AI usage. You can learn more about each of these roles by going into the Quick Policy menu or heading on over to Microsoft Learn. We're going to start with what most organizations begin with, a data leak policy. Now, the Getting Started page here is going to give us all the details that we need to get ourselves going. End-to-end quick policies are designed to take under 2 minutes to complete. And I'm going to create a quick little thing here that just says example, just an example policy for us to work with. We can choose the user scope that this needs to apply to. Now, recommendation is to apply to everyone, but you can effectively pick that as much as you need. And then we can go through and check the events that have been pre-filled. It'll show the triggering events, i.e. the indicators that are being brought in, as well as any additional settings that have been applied. So once you've confirmed a name and a scope, everything else will be ready and pre-filled for you. Note the ability to hit the Customize button down the bottom. So if there's something here that's not quite right for your particular environment, you can go through and customize before you're ready. But if everything you need's there, simply hit create policy and we're done. Now, our policy has finished creating and immediately we've actually got a recommendation. When we do create these quick policies, whilst they will work out of the box, there's usually some adjustments you can make to essentially get them to fit the tone of your organization a little bit more closely. So what we can do is simply select the policy itself, and then we can go through and we can edit it. Now I've selected it here so you can see some of the different policy settings that we can work with and the ability to download those policy settings. But if you need to adjust it, simply just double click through. At this point, we'll bring up the flyout where we have the ability to check the health and the settings of the policy, but we can also hit edit to go through and start to think about what other indicators we might wish to ingest as part of this structure. Note there is a huge list of different indicators that we can work with, and it is recommended that we go through and choose essentially what happens next. We've selected the indicators, but we haven't indicated which one of them are relevant to us. So what we're going to do is modify the template and just go through and make some slight adjustments. First, we can check the template that is being used. It is data leak policy, and we see the recommendations are DLP policy, devices onboarded, physical badging, etc. These are all considered optional, and the more signals you can feed in, the more accurate the data will be. We have the name that we provided earlier, but we can provide an additional description, and we can also scope this to specific users. Think of this as the full version of the dialog. Note also here the ability to exclude certain users and groups. So if you need to ensure that certain people are not covered by a policy, this is how we do it. Next, we can choose to prioritize content. This one is optional, but adding a prioritization matrix to certain types of content located in certain areas, as an example, gives us a way to, well, prioritize. It means that we can ensure that when this does get triggered, it represents a higher risk event comparative to other policies that may be for general users. To learn more about it, check out the documentation page. Next, we need to choose how we're going to trigger this event. So what actually makes this policy go? Now, out of the box, we use exfiltration activities as the primary mechanism to be able to detect this, but it's not the only type. We can select turn on indicators here to take a look through some of the other indicators that are theoretically available, but are not yet enabled for this policy. Now that we've selected that, here is the full dropdown. Any indicators we turn on here will become broadly available for the organization to use later. But if you wish to remove an indicator from use in your environment, you'll need to go back to the settings menu and actually remove it from there, in the place that we enabled Office and also took a look at some of the other pieces around heuristics. Once we've confirmed the indicators that we currently have selected, you can easily go through and open each of these up to confirm that. You simply hit save to continue. Now, it's not just about choosing specific activities that will trigger the policy. We also need to be thinking about a sequence that triggers. Think about these as two separate types of actions. An activity would be the download of a file, but a sequence would be a download and upload in combination. So we can also go through and pick indicators that are related to sequence patterns. Note things like syncing content or downloading content from specific locations, as well as the ability to look at, say, obfuscation indicators. Just like we see with the other one though, anything you enable in this state will become available for the organization as a whole, and anything you wish to remove more broadly, including things like Microsoft Copilot responses as part of the structure, you will need to do so in the settings menu. We'll hit save to continue along now that we've got both our initial pieces of information and the sequences to follow. With our triggering events selected, we can finally go through and actually think about the indicators we're going to collate. Triggering indicators do not have to be the same as some of the other pieces we pull in. Because we have the ability to adjust thresholds about when something is triggered, we may actually want to create different sorts of triggering events that collate different types of indicators together to understand the potential risk of a policy more broadly. So, as you adjust your thresholds, we recommend starting with the recommended and building from there. Now, the indicators here are the ones that are going to generate alerts. Adjusting these are going to trigger which ones are not about creating the policy or acting the policy out, but which ones are actually going to be relevant in an alert that gets generated for a security team or as part of a general insider risk management structure. All you need to do is do the same structure of choosing your indicators. Again, note that anything you enable here that is not currently enabled will be enabled for the organization as a whole, as long as you have permissions to do so, and we can simply just add them in. If there's anything additional you need, such as downgrading sensitivity that is relevant to the policy that you're building, simply select them and include them in the structure. With all of our settings now done, hit Next, and then we can save. If there is any additional indicators that will require specific extra indicators to be turned on, i.e. if we want to trigger based on this in a sequence, we also need to be able to gather the indicators raw, we'll of course let you know. Again, built-in thresholds are available here. We recommend starting with those and then choosing your own over time. There are some mechanisms to also go through and choose it based on user activity, but much of this is based on the specific indicators that you select, so it won't be available for every type of policy. We'll finish things out, hit submit, and now our policy is ready to go. It will take up to 24 hours to actually roll this out to the point where it will start generating alerts. So as always, plan early and deploy as soon as you can, and then iterate over time to build this out to get it into a better state. Now we've created our first policy, but there's actually some additional indicators I want to go through and enable. Rather than doing it mid-policy, I will just quickly go show you where you can enable the specific ones for defensive endpoint. It's going to be important that we take a look at what indicators are available here, because this is going to be defender for endpoint alerts, not the raw data itself. If we take a look in our insider risk management, then we go through and we open up our integrations, we can see the different integrations available for endpoints there. Here's our policy indicators. We'll drop down and we'll quickly head into those defender for endpoint indicators there. Note the two actions: defense evasion technique attempted and unwanted or unapproved malicious software enabled. These are very particular types of integrations and are not necessarily every single piece of the puzzle. Note the rest of the indicators that are available. They are focused on browsing patterns. This is the critical lesson to learn. The Defender for Endpoint integration is extremely good, but it's heavily reliant on the browser-based integration, with only a few critical alerts related to the insider risk components and risky behavior being tied to the endpoint itself. Always keep this in mind as part of the integration, especially because even with just the signals I've turned on there, we have just opened up a humongous door of opportunity for the types of policies we can start integrating with. Now, there is one other change I do want to make while we are here. I want to go through and add in a priority user group. This is going to be important for us to use in some policies I want to set up in a moment. So we'll create ourselves a priority user group here that is going to be focused on the finance team. This will allow us to create something that is insider risk managed focused, but focused in a very particular area. When we can create more scoped policies that are not applying to lots and lots of users, we can create something that can be more specific. I'll quickly hit add members and I'll add the members of the finance team here. Back in a moment. All right, our finance team is added in. We'll hit next, we'll jump in, and we will choose who is able to actually review this information. Remember, a sensitive role requires a sensitive privileged viewer. We need someone who has an equivalent level of administrative privilege or the right training to be able to work with the sort of sensitive information that might get exposed in the insider risk management cohort related to the sensitive user group we're making. This will involve a lot of stakeholder negotiation to understand where people sit in the space. But in our case, we're lucky. We have an insider risk management team, so we can allocate it to them because they are trained for the position. We'll hit submit, and with our two new pieces in play, our indicators focused on our endpoints and our user group, we can now get ourselves set up with our next type of policy. I'm going to jump back into our insider risk management solution, and we're going to just head straight back into the Create Policy menu. Once we're in there, we're going to create a custom policy. I'm not going to do this fully customized though. We are going to leverage one of the pre-existing templates that are available because, frankly, it is going to match our scenario very well. I'll hit Create Policy, select Custom Policy, and immediately we're presented with that template list. If you do need to create something fully from scratch, you absolutely can. But the thing that I need is something related to our priority users. Now, it's not data leaks I'm interested in per se. What I am interested in is a security policy violation that is being undertaken by a priority user. Very particular sort of nuanced investigation, but gives us a clear scope to work with. We've got the priority user group, the Defender for Endpoint integration, and the alerts being fed in, which means we have all of the necessary parts to get started with this template. Make sure you check if you are looking to integrate a template, what particular indicators you need to have on and enabled to be able to use it. It'll give you an idea of the sorts of signals that would be needed to detect that sort of behavior. You can also see disabling of malware, disabling of protections. These are the sorts of things that we can definitely feature within the scope of our Defender for Endpoint policies. With a click select of the finance team, note 10 priority users per policy is the maximum there. We can simply continue through with the same sort of setup we saw in our other policy menu. Next, we have the ability to prioritize content. Usually, this is actually not gathering data that is going to involve files and things like that, so we don't have the same nuance. Also note the triggering events already been set up. This is based on the risk scores around user activity within the Defender for Endpoint, so we're pulling the signals from there. And last of all, we're presented with a list of potential indicators we can use. Again, the more indicators you feed in for alerts could lead to more noise, but does give us more mechanisms under which to actually trigger the policy and send that alert out that a risky activity may have occurred. I'm happy with the default settings for what indicators are there and how they should trigger, so we'll simply hit submit. Very little customization required to make that template work, but definitely a little bit of setup to make sure that everything has worked correctly. Now, earlier I talked about some of the different ways we can use notice templates. I want to just focus in on that a little bit and show you what the user interface looks like to actually create one. It's a little bit bare bones, but that's okay. It's all about what the user receives on the end. There is actually some very useful little bits of nuance you get around CCing and BCCing that we can control. So I'll run you through how we create those templates. All right, we're heading straight over into the templates to get started with creating that template for user communications. Jump into the notice templates there, and I don't have any example ones to work with. There are some samples available on the web over in Microsoft Learn, but we're going to create one totally from scratch. The key here is both consistency with a little bit of novelty. We want to make sure that users don't get bored, desensitized to the sort of information they receive when a template comes through. Give it a name so you can identify what it is, choose who it needs to be sent from. Very important if we are trying to get users to trust that this email is true and is coming from a trusted source. Ensure any CCs and BCCs are targeted accordingly. You may wish to have a number of different templates for different scenarios that are quite targeted to different teams, and then give it a subject that makes it clear that this is coming from a trusted location. In our case, we are going to have unusual activity detected, please review. And I'll just quickly drop in the HTML for the email here. All right, our template's now in place. Note the customizations in here about device security settings. Make sure your templates are actually relevant to the particular warning that you are giving. And with that, we have gone through and created a number of different important pieces. Notice templates, alerts, and our first policies using both quick and custom. There's a lot more to it, but that should give you the basics to get yourself started and to get the ball rolling. In this video, we covered 3 primary topics: the planning and preparation of insider risk management and all of the various policies that come alongside that, how to prepare insider risk management as an environment, the connectors and data points that you need to enable to ensure that it's going to do the things that it needs to do, and then we talked about how to actually create and manage the policies themselves. Across this, I hope you've gotten visibility of what the tool is for, how it's designed to work, and how we can utilize it to ensure your organizational compliance where required. Thank you so much for joining us for this video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.